She appeared like a ghost at the edge of twilight, a slender figure against the fading Nevada sky. Molly Quinn stood at Jedediah Carver's ranch gate, one hand clutching a cast-iron skillet, while the other smoothed dust from her threadbare dress. The Humboldt wind whipped dry grass around her ankles, tugging at her copper-colored hair where it had loosened from its practical braid. Folks say there's something particular about a stranger arriving at sundown. I've seen it myself in my younger days, that moment when a body stands suspended between coming and going, between hope and regret. The Quinn woman was no different, except perhaps in the way she held that skillet, not as a burden but as a talisman. Behind lace curtains gone yellow with time, wary eyes watched her approach. The ranch had stood silent as a gravestone these past years, and visitors were about as welcome as rattlers in a boot. Still, Molly walked forward with the determined step of someone who'd crossed too many miles to turn back. The porch boards creaked beneath her feet as she knocked firmly on the weathered door. When it swung open, revealing a tall man with shoulders bent from years of solitary labor, she wasted no breath on pleasantries. "I don't gamble with words, sir, but I bake pies that calm dust storms," she announced, her voice carrying the faintest lilt of Ireland beneath its frontier practicality. Jedediah Carver studied her without speaking, took in the iron-willed eyes that met his without flinching, the dust caked to her boots that spoke of long miles, the determined set of her jaw. A lifetime of frontier living had taught him to read people quickly, and what he saw wasn't desperation but determination. "You're hired," he said simply, then added more softly, "and you're safe." The relief that crossed her face was brief as a cloud shadow, there and gone again. She nodded once, shifting her grip on the skillet. Despite the journey's wear, the iron gleamed with careful polishing, revealing a woman who maintained dignity even amid poverty. Autumn 1883 had not been kind to the Humboldt Valley. The Ruby Mountains stood watch over land parched by 3 years without sufficient rain. What had once been fertile grazing land now cracked beneath the sun like old leather, stubborn and unyielding. Jed's 3-room ranch house had stood cold since Abigail died in 1876. The kitchen hearth had gone dark, the rooms silent, save for the occasional creak of settling wood. Outside, 35 underfed cattle and 3 Morgan horses were all that remained of what had once been a promising spread. $320 in unpaid feed bills, threatened foreclosure before winter snows, could even arrive to blanket his failure. Before the next dawn broke across the valley, Molly had rebuilt the kitchen fire that had been dead for 7 years. Her movements were precise, economical, as she arranged the meager supplies she found, sorting, wiping, assessing. The worn floorboards seemed to warm beneath her touch, as if the house itself stirred with curiosity at this new presence. Mrs. Holloway didn't wait for a proper invitation. The neighbor woman appeared mid-morning, ostensibly bringing a jar of preserved peaches but carrying judgment heavier than any preserve. "This arrangement," she began, her eyes darting between the kitchen and the closed door to Jed's room. "Folks will talk. A single woman, a widower propriety, demands a quick marriage or separate lodging." Molly planted her skillet firmly on the stove, the sound of iron against iron punctuating her response. "My cooking belongs to whoever respects my work, ma'am, nothing else does." That evening, when the mountains had turned purple against the darkening sky, Jed confessed his troubles over a supper more satisfying than any he'd eaten in years. "You might have hired onto a sinking ship," he said, pushing the last bite of cornbread through molasses. "This ranch is drowning in debt." Molly nodded, unsurprised. "I've fled 4 frontier towns myself," she replied. "An abusive boarding house keeper named Horace Pike falsely accused me of theft in the last one." Between them passed an unspoken understanding, the kind that forms only between those who've watched everything slip through their fingers like water. Both knew what it meant to lose everything and to keep going anyway. As they cleared the table, dark thunderclouds gathered over the mountains, promising rain that would likely miss the valley as it had so many times before. Lightning briefly illuminated Jed's weathered face as he spoke. "Can't promise when I'll have wages for you," he admitted. The flash caught Molly's determined expression, highlighting the green of her eyes turned hard as flint. "I didn't come for money," she said quietly. "I came for walls that don't have Horace Pike behind them." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain that might never arrive. The kitchen told its own sad story, plain as daylight. Molly stood in its center that first morning, taking stock like a general surveying abandoned battleground. Cracked cups lined shelves thick with dust, while tarnished spoons lay scattered in drawers as if dropped in hasty retreat. The pantry offered meager welcome, a half-sack of coffee beans and dried pinto beans that had survived neglect only by virtue of their stubborn nature. I've seen kitchens like this before, places where grief has settled deeper than the dust. They carry their memories in the water stains on ceilings and the worn paths in floorboards. This one had been waiting 7 years for someone to notice its suffering. When night fell across the valley, Molly worked by kerosene lamplight, scrubbing floors with a determination that spoke of more than simple cleanliness. Her movements held purpose beyond mere tidying, each stroke of the brush reclaiming territory, each arranged cup declaring intent to stay a while. The meager supplies she found were sorted with near-reverent care, as if arranging altar pieces for some frontier religion of hearth and home. Jed watched from the doorway, his shadow stretching across freshly scrubbed boards. He said nothing, but disappeared into the darkness outside, only to return moments later with an armful of purple lupine flowers gathered from a hidden wash near the creek bed. Without comment, he placed them beside her bucket and retreated to his room. Molly paused in her labor, fingers hovering above the unexpected offering. Then, with decisive movements, she placed the wild blooms in a cloudy mason jar and positioned it precisely where morning light would strike first when dawn broke over the eastern mountains. The sky opened without warning that second night, as if heaven itself had grown weary of withholding mercy from parched land. Rain fell not in gentle blessing, but in furious sheets that seemed determined to wash away years of drought in a single hour. Lightning walked on crooked legs across the valley floor, striking with terrible precision. "The horses!" Jed's voice carried through the downpour as Molly stood at the window. One such bolt had found the barn, splintering rafters already weakened by years of neglect. She didn't hesitate. Wrapping her shawl tight, Molly grabbed her skillet from its place by the stove and charged into the deluge. The cold rain stung her face as she rounded the corner to find Jed pinned beneath a fallen beam, his shoulder trapped as water poured through the broken roof. "Can't move it," he gasped, rain mixing with sweat on his face. Molly wedged her skillet beneath the beam, creating just enough leverage for Jed to pull free. Together they turned to the panicked Morgan horses, their eyes rolling white with terror as thunder cracked overhead. She shielded the kerosene lantern behind her skillet, its iron surface reflecting enough light to guide them through the chaos. "Easy now," she murmured to the nearest horse, her voice carrying calm beneath nature's rage. Leading each animal in turn, they guided the Morgans to shelter beneath the remaining sound portion of the barn. When the last horse stood secure, they collapsed under the porch eaves, soaked to the bone and shaking from exertion. "Thank you," Jed said simply, the words carrying weight beyond their size. Between them passed something unspoken but palpable, as the rain itself, the quiet understanding that comes only from facing danger shoulder to shoulder. Morning light revealed Jed's injury in harsh detail. His shoulder had turned angry purple where the beam had trapped him, the bruising spreading across his collarbone like spilled ink. "Hold still now," Molly instructed, applying a poultice of crushed desert sage mixed with rendered fat. Her hands worked with practiced efficiency, wrapping the compress with strips torn from a clean dish towel. "Where'd you learn doctorin'?" he asked, watching her skilled movements. "Not doctorin', just making do," she replied. "My father Thomas died in a silver mine explosion when a support timber failed. After that, I learned to patch what needed mending." Her hands stilled briefly. "Lost our family bakery to $62 debt after he was gone." Jed nodded slowly, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Where'd you learn to bake like you claim?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "My mother was Irish. Taught me to put magic in ordinary flour. Said good bread could heal most troubles." Her voice softened. "Malaria took her in 1881. Came through our mining camp like judgment." Jed's gaze traveled to the cast-iron skillet hanging in its new place by the stove. "Only thing you saved from home?" "Only thing worth the carrying," she answered, tying off his bandage with a firm knot. "I've been running so long I've forgotten what it means to stop and breathe. Every town, every refuge, eventually pushed me out. Why should this dusty ranch be different?" Yet his eyes hold no demand, only quiet respect that makes me wonder if safety might actually exist. My hands remember what my heart tries to forget. Mother's lessons about hearth and home. Can I risk building something here when the next storm might wash it all away? The skillet survived, perhaps I can too. The kitchen at Carver's Ranch had slept cold for 7 years, but under Molly Quinn's touch, it stirred back to life like winter-dormant land beneath spring Sunday. Dawn broke earlier in that kitchen now, marked by the scent of sage-scented eggs and the rhythmic thump of her hands working dough against the wooden table. The biscuits came out lopsided most mornings, but they filled the belly just the same. Jed noted their misshapen nature one morning as pale October light filtered through curtains she'd washed twice to remove the worst of their yellowing. "These biscuits look like Nevada after a flood," he remarked, turning one in his weathered fingers. Then something remarkable happened. A smile crossed his face, brief as a shooting star, but just as bright against the night sky of his solemnity. First one she'd seen since her arrival. Molly knew enough of men to understand the rarity of such a gift. "Geography was never my strongest subject," she replied, the corner of her mouth lifting to match his. That afternoon, when Jed rode into Elko for supplies, he returned with a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He measured coffee into the pot with unusual precision, his movements deliberate as he found words. "Merchant mentioned a drifter askin' about a red-headed woman with cookin' skills," he said finally, voice casual though his shoulders had gone rigid as fence posts. "Said he seemed mighty interested in findin' her whereabouts." The air between them chilled faster than the weather outside, which had itself turned suddenly and viciously cold. Frost formed on the water trough overnight, and the cattle, already thin from poor grazing, huddled together for warmth on the northern pasture. "We haven't feed enough to last half the winter," Jed admitted the next morning, breath clouding in the pre-dawn air as they stood surveying the herd. "Not with this early cold snap. I've seen men go hollow when the land turns against them. Watch their eyes take on that 1,000-yard stare. That means they're seeing the end of things." Jed had that look about him now, not surrender exactly, but the weary recognition of a fight that might not be winnable. Molly stretched what little they had with the ingenuity of the desperate. One scrawny chicken became breakfast stew, then midday soup with dumplings, then evening pot pie with the last scraps mixed with whatever vegetables she could coax from the neglected kitchen garden. When flour ran low, she experimented with grinding acorns gathered from the lone oak by the creek, mixing the bitter meal with their precious wheat to extend it. "Never tasted anything like this bread," Jed commented, neither praise nor complaint in his tone, just quiet wonder at her resourcefulness. The railroad survey team that might have brought cattle buyers past 10 miles south without stopping to inspect Jed's stock. A local rancher who'd expressed interest in 2 of the Morgan horses changed his mind when he saw their ribs showing through winter coats. Jed worked from sunup past sundown, moving the cattle to whatever patches of grazing remained, returning with shoulders stooped lower each evening. When the county clerk rode out personally to deliver the formal notice, Molly took it from his hands before Jed could reach the porch. The man removed his hat, a gesture of respect that spoke louder than his words about their chances. 30 days, he said simply. Then the auction begins. That night, after the clerk had gone, Jed disappeared into the barn until well after darkness fell. Molly kept his supper warm at the back of the stove, stirring it occasionally as she calculated precisely how many days their remaining supplies might stretch if she halved her own portions. When he finally returned, he carried something wrapped in oilcloth. Without ceremony, he mounted a bent nail above the kitchen door and hung an upside-down horseshoe upon it. "For luck," he explained, seeing her questioning look. "Ma always said kitchens need good fortune more than barns." Later, as the moon rose high enough to cast silver light through the window, they sat at the kitchen table with cups of chicory that pretended to be coffee. The hour had grown late enough for truth-telling, that strange territory between wakefulness and dreams where secrets sometimes find voice. "Pike claimed I stole money from the boarding house," Molly said, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "Truth was, he gambled it away, then threatened my life when I found his ledger showing the missing funds." Jed nodded slowly, as if her words confirmed something he'd already guessed. "After Abigail passed, I lost more than a wife," he confessed. "Lost purpose, hope, any will to keep this place going. Just existed day to day, watching it all slip away." His calloused fingers spread flat against the table's surface, as if measuring the distance between what was and what could have been. "This land's dying same as my spirit was," he admitted, voice low as creek water over smooth stones. "Until you brought life back to this kitchen." The words hung between them, neither seeking immediate response, just acknowledgement of a truth too substantial for casual handling. Morning brought Mrs. Holloway back to their door, this time without judgment in her eyes. She carried a flour sack in one hand, a small crock of butter in the other. "Harvest fair's coming," she announced, setting both on the table with the authority of a general positioning troops. "Baking contest has $100 prize." Hope flared briefly until she continued. "Contests controlled by Evelyn Hartwell, mayor's wife. Woman only awards friends." Mrs. Holloway's mouth pinched tight as a coin purse. "Been that way 5 years running." Then she pressed a folded paper into Molly's hand, an entry form with official letterhead. "Some fights worth having, girl," she said, her gaze direct as a frontier challenge. After Mrs. Holloway departed, Molly spread their remaining supplies across the kitchen table, a visual accounting of possibility against necessity. With practiced hands, she measured what remained. Flour enough for one perfect pie, if she added the acorn meal in precise proportion, 3 wrinkled apples from the cellar, a handful of sage that might complement the sweet in unexpected ways. Her fingers calculated what her mind already knew. She could craft something extraordinary, but only once. There would be no trial runs, no second chances. Night fell early as October edged toward November. Molly stood at the kitchen window, planning tomorrow's work, when movement caught her eye. A shadow leaned against the side gate, the unmistakable silhouette of Wade Crowley, the drifter who had once menaced her in Junction Hollow. He stood watching the kitchen window with the patient stillness of a predator who knows his prey is cornered. The horseshoe above the door caught the last light of evening, gleaming dully against the gathering darkness outside. Dawn had barely stretched its pink fingers across the valley when Molly Quinn stood before her meager supplies, carefully measuring what remained. Her auburn hair was tied back severe-like, revealing a face set with determination as she weighed pinches of dried sage against precious spoonfuls of sugar. "Lord knows these apples seen better days," she muttered, cutting around bruised spots with practiced economy. The desert sage she'd gathered from rocky outcroppings behind the barn would need to work its magic, transforming ordinary into exceptional. A body couldn't win no contest with ordinary, not when salvation depended on extraordinary. Footsteps on the porch announced Jed's return before the door swung wide. His face, normally weathered to impassivity, showed the faintest glimmer of triumph as he placed 6 eggs and a small burlap sack on the table. "Henderson's gave the eggs," he explained, unwrapping the sugar with careful hands. "Widower Simmons had sugar put by. Said any woman willin' to take you on deserved what help folks could spare." Molly's hands stilled momentarily. "Take you on? That what they're sayin'?" "Folks'll talk," Jed replied, with the philosophical shrug of a man who'd weathered worse storms than gossip. "Let 'em. Words don't break no bones nor foreclose no ranch." The kitchen filled with fragrant steam as morning aged toward afternoon. 3 experimental pies cooled on the windowsill, each slightly different in its blend of sage and sweet. Outside, the mountains stood silent witness to her industry, their ancient faces neither encouraging nor discouraging, merely present, as they'd been for countless human struggles beneath their shadow. Mrs. Holloway appeared mid-afternoon, arms laden with folded fabric. "Ain't much," she said, shaking out a serviceable brown dress with mended lace at the collar. "But cleaner than what you've been wearin', and more fittin' for a contest where appearance counts almost much as flavor." "Almost," Molly repeated with a pointed glance. "Almost," Mrs. Holloway agreed with the faintest twitch of her mouth. "Evelyn Hartwell may control that judgin' table like a queen on her throne, but even she can't deny true quality when it stares her in the face." Her eyes narrowed shrewdly. "Though she'll surely try." As Molly cleaned flour from her hands, Mrs. Holloway moved deliberately to the window, positioning the cast-iron skillet where it would catch the afternoon light. "Leave this here," she said quietly. "If that man's watchin', best he thinks you're stayin' put." The harvest fair hummed with activity beneath a clear autumn sky. Children darted between booths, while ranchers discussed cattle prices in low, concerned voices. The ladies' baking tables formed a half-circle near the judge's platform, each contestant standing protectively beside her offering. Evelyn Hartwell moved between entries like a general inspecting troops, her silver hair arranged in elaborate coils beneath a fashionable hat. Her lorgnette rose repeatedly to examine pies with exaggerated scrutiny, lingering longest on those produced by her social circle. "Unexpected company today, Mrs." Holloway whispered, nodding toward two unfamiliar men in city suits. "Railroad purchasing agent and federal livestock inspector. Don't recall them being invited to judge." Before Molly could respond, a familiar figure appeared at the fairground entrance. Wade Crowley's immaculate coat seemed untouched by travel dust as he moved purposefully toward the sheriff, papers clutched in one manicured hand. Even at this distance, the coldness in his eyes registered like a physical blow. "Ladies and gentlemen," Evelyn Hartwell announced, voice carrying across the grounds. "Initial inspection complete. While all entries show effort, I must regretfully disqualify Miss Quinn's pie due to the inclusion of foreign substances." Her lorgnette pointed accusingly at Molly's creation. Desert herbs have no place in proper baking. The world seemed to narrow to this single moment of humiliation. All those watching eyes, all those whispers. I've spent years making myself invisible, hoping to disappear from men like Crowley. Now I must choose. Hide again or stand my ground with my skillet and my truth, even if it means losing this chance to save Jed's ranch. "Ma'am, if I might." The railroad agent stepped forward, reaching for the condemned pie with unexpected determination. "Contest rules or no, that smells mighty inviting." Before Evelyn could protest, he cut a generous slice and took a hearty bite. His eyebrows rose appreciatively as he chewed. "By thunder!" The livestock inspector followed suit, helping himself to a portion. "Ma'am, that's the finest thing I've tasted since leaving Street Louis," he declared, voice carrying to the gathering crowd. "What did you call these herbs?" "Desert sage," Molly answered, straightening her spine. "Grows wild hereabouts." The railroad man pulled a notebook from his pocket. "My company feeds 30 men at each camp along the new line. We'd pay handsomely for regular supplies of pies with that distinctive flavor. Say, 60 head of spring calves and $450 advance payment." As Molly's trembling hand signed the hastily prepared contract, Wade Crowley approached, his shadow falling across the paper. The sheriff studied Crowley's documents with narrowed eyes, turning pages with deliberate slowness. "These papers," the lawman said finally, "show Junction Hollow debt already paid by baker named Mary Quinn. That your kin, miss?" "My mother," Molly replied softly, heart hammering against her ribs. Crowley's voice remained smooth as polished stone. "The debt may be settled, Sheriff, but Miss Quinn still owes for damage to reputation when she fled." In that moment, Molly understood with crystal clarity that no distance would ever be enough. Her safety, her future, required a permanent solution to Crowley's pursuit. The net was closing, but for the first time, she stood on ground worth defending. The railroad agent's eyes narrowed as he studied Wade Crowley's face in the fading light of the harvest fair. Recognition dawned slow but certain, like a winter sunrise over the rubies. "Sheriff, I believe this fella matches a wanted circular passin through our office last month. Extortion charges in 3 territories, if memory serves." Crowley's hand twitched toward his vest pocket, but the sheriff's deputy was quicker, stepping close enough that retreat became impossible. Folks gathered round like crows to corn, sensing justice about to unfold. Mrs. Holloway pushed forward, bonnet strings quivering with righteous fury. "That man been skulkin' round town these past 3 days, askin' questions that carried threats inside 'em. Watched him follow the Quinn woman from the general store yesterday, keepin' to the shadows like a coyote trackin' a wounded doe." The crowd murmured, a sound like wind through autumn cottonwoods. Jed stood silent beside Molly, then reached inside his worn leather vest. He withdrew a small book bound in faded blue cloth, its edges softened by years of handling. "My Abigail kept careful account of those who troubled our peace," he said, voice steady as he handed the journal to the sheriff. "Page 43 mentions a man named Crowley, who came round during her final illness, claiming our mortgage had been sold to his company, tried to force papers on her while I was out with the herd." The sheriff thumbed through the pages, his weathered face growing harder with each turn. When he looked up, his gaze moved between Crowley and the gathered testimonies before him. The pattern emerged clear as wagon tracks after rain. A man who hunted vulnerable women across the territories, using debt as his weapon and the law as his shield. "Reckon you'll be stayin' in our accommodations while we sort these claims," the sheriff said, nodding to his deputy. "Telegram office stays open till 6. Plenty time to wire Colorado and Utah territories about their interest in your whereabouts." The crowd parted as Crowley was led away, his protests fading like a dust devil spinning itself out against the mountains. In the sudden quiet, the railroad purchasing agent approached Molly with purpose in his stride. "Mrs. Quinn, I wish to extend special commendation for your sage apple pie. Our company supplies 16 camps between here and Sacramento." He produced papers from his satchel with flourish. $450 advance payment, with regular orders to follow. Sign here, if you please." The pen felt strange in Molly's calloused fingers, not the weight of it, but what it represented. Jed stood at her shoulder, silent witness to fortune's sudden turn. "That'll clear the feed store debt," he whispered, "with room to breathe till spring." The crowd that had gathered for justice remained to witness this second miracle, murmuring approval as Molly's signature dried on the contract. Then came the third surprise of the evening, approaching with the stiff-backed determination of Evelyn Hartwell, the mayor's wife. "Mrs. Quinn," she began, her tone suggesting the words cost her considerable effort, "it appears I misjudged both your character and your talents." She smoothed her silk skirts, a gesture that seemed to gather her resolve. "The town council met this morning. We find ourselves in need of a proper establishment, serving quality fare to the increasing rail traffic." From her reticule, she withdrew a folded document bearing the town seal, $150 in startup funds and the vacant storefront beside the mercantile, should you wish to establish Quinn's Pie House in Elko proper. Silence fell again, heavy as winter snow. Every eye turned to Molly, whose face revealed nothing of the storm within. She accepted the papers with steady hands, folding them carefully. "I'll consider your offer, Mrs. Hartwell," she said simply, "and I thank you for it." That night, Molly sat alone at the kitchen table, the contract and town offer spread before her like a crossroads made visible. The ranch had become sanctuary, but Elko offered independence. Dawn was still hours away when she made her choice. She packed her meager belongings by lamplight, folding each garment with precise care. The skillet she placed atop the bundle, its surface reflecting the first hint of coming day. Without waking Jed, she walked away from the ranch that had sheltered her, the town offer clutched in her hand. 3 miles toward Elko, she stopped where the road forked. The eastern sky lightened behind her, painting the Ruby Mountains in gold and crimson. She turned, watching sunrise illuminate Jed's ranch in the distance. The broken fence they'd mended together, the barn with its new roof beams, the kitchen window where lamplight still burned like a beacon. When she returned, Jed was in the barn, hammering new supports against the coming winter. He didn't hear her approach, didn't notice her standing in the doorway until she spoke. "I'm not leaving," she announced, "unless you fire me." The skillet hung from her hand, returned to its proper place at her side rather than packed away. Jed set down his hammer, studying her face as he had that first evening. Then, with work-roughened fingers, he reached into his pocket and withdrew something that caught the morning light. A silver ring, simple and worn smooth, with the date 1876 engraved inside its band. "Then you're not just hired," he said softly. "You're home." The ring gleamed in his palm, neither demand nor plea but offering. Molly looked down at it, this small circle that had survived loss and grief to become possibility once more. Behind them, beyond the open barn door, dust rose on the horizon, a distant rider approaching from the Elko Road, bearing news yet unknown as Molly considered the silver band in Jed's weathered hand. The kitchen bloomed like desert flowers after rain. Where once stood barren shelves now gleamed rows of jewel-colored preserves, amber peach, ruby raspberry, and emerald cucumber pickles. Herbs hung in fragrant bundles from the ceiling beams, their scents mingling with the yeast-rich aroma of bread rising in dented pans. Molly moved through this transformed space with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who'd planted seeds in doubtful soil and lived to see them flourish. "Hired me for cookin', kept me for miracles," Jed remarked one morning, leaning against the doorframe. The lines in his face had softened these past months, weathered still but no longer carved by solitude. Outside, cattle grazed on land, renewed by railroad contracts that brought regular income. The barn stood straight-backed again, reinforced with fresh-cut lumber that no longer groaned in the Nevada wind. Molly's gaze drifted to the small drawer beside her bed where Jed's silver ring rested. She'd accepted it with quiet grace but hadn't yet placed it on her finger. The choice remained entirely hers, a gift Jed offered with the same patience he showed breaking wild horses. "Some things can't be rushed," he'd said when he gave it to her. "Land or hearts." Morning sunlight spilled through newly washed windows when Mrs. Hartwell's buggy appeared at the gate. The mayor's wife had traded her lorgnette for spectacles that sat more humbly on her nose. Her manner changed since the harvest fair. "I've reconsidered my proposal," she announced, spreading papers across the kitchen table that Jed had built from old barn wood. Not ownership of a town storefront, but partnership. Quinn's Traveling Pies would supply railroad camps and nearby settlements, with this ranch as your home base. Molly's fingers traced the contract's careful lettering. "And you'd handle the business side?" "For 30%, Mrs. Hartwell confirmed. "Your skill, my connections. Seems a fair weathering of the trail together." As they spoke, the postmaster's boy arrived with a telegram. Wade Crowley captured in Colorado territory, facing charges that would keep him occupied for years to come. Freedom settled over Molly like a warm shawl. The following Sunday, Jed helped Molly hang a freshly painted sign beside the ranch gate. "Mercy's Kitchen," it proclaimed in bold letters, with a skillet twin to her own painted beneath the words. "Mighty curious name," Sheriff Bowden remarked, passing on his dappled mare. Molly brushed red dust from her hands. "Not running anymore," she explained, watching distant thunderheads gather over the Ruby Mountains. "Building instead. Mercy saved us both, his offering it, my learning to accept it." That evening, the kitchen glowed with fresh fire as darkness settled across the valley. 2 tin mugs of coffee steamed on the table between them, and a single lupine bloom, first of the season, stood in a jar where lamplight caught its purple glory. Molly's fingers closed around the silver ring that had waited these many months. With deliberate grace, she slid it onto her finger, then placed her hand atop Jed's work-worn knuckles. "Reckon this means you're staying on permanent," he said, voice rough as creekstones. "Reckon it does," she answered, the Irish lilt in her voice softening the Western words. "Folks claim there's something particular about a decision made at twilight, when day balances on the edge of night. I've seen it myself, how small mercies, offered and accepted, can build homes stronger than any Western storm." If you're hankering for more tales of frontier courage, where a hand on a shoulder or a pie pulled from hot coals changes the course of lonely lives, best subscribe to hear what comes next along this dusty trail.